I think the room is quite small. Thanks a lot for joining us today for this session in which we are going to try and provide some perspectives on the latest developments in the field of political economy and development. And so the question that we ask, and we're going to answer positively, mathematically, is whether the field is at a critical juncture. So I'm Vincent Pons, I'm a faculty at the business school, and Ben, who is presenting with me today, he's a faculty at the Boston University. We're friends, we have lots of projects together, and so we're very happy to do this session together. Feel free to ask questions throughout. We're going to mostly present the work of others, so feel free to raise your hand and criticize his work if you want. Feel free to express enthusiasm about what we say, or tell us if we're missing something very important in your work. So, big picture, if we try to trace the history of political economy and development, the past is a past in which development economists for a very long time focused on very big macro questions. But if we look at the past, we think, oh, they were not producing very convincing causal evidence. They were asking questions we care about, but were perhaps not very compelled about the answers that were provided or about the empirical evidence that was provided in support of these responses. So some examples that people have worked a lot on were, for instance, what are the macroeconomic determinants of development? What explains that some countries grow and manage to lead their population out of poverty? What explains that China succeeded when so many other countries failed to do so? Or studying the different stages of development. Is it the case that all countries are going to go first to a stage in which the agriculture sector increases its productivity, and then that generates surplus labor, which feeds industrialization? So these were some of the big questions that people were asking. The present, or let's say the last 15 or 20 years, is of course what we all know, the credibility revolution, and I would say particularly in development economics field experiments that have enabled us to gather much more reliable evidence that we're much more confident in, on factors and policies that, for instance, are conducive to better health, better education, access to finance for poor households, etc. This is evidence that has been collected, again, a lot through randomized experiments conducted at a very small level, very individual level. You have lots of papers that have been focusing just on a city or on a small area of a unique country. So, of course, the perspective that this has embraced is much more narrow, geographically speaking, than the earlier perspective. What we believe is that the future is a future in which these two traditions are going to merge together. And we have started seeing that. Increasingly, the literature is going back to the big macro questions, but has learned a lot from field experiments, from the attention to causality, from strategies that can be used beyond just running experiments to establish causality. And so is now providing much better identification, or at least trying to do so, on these whole big questions that we see here about. Some of the precursors are, for instance, the famous paper by Nathan Nunn on slave trade, or a paper by Stelos Mikalopoulos and Elias Papaoian on pre-colonial ethnic institutions and contemporary African development. Now, there are two major challenges in this new strand of the literature that tries to combine addressing these big macro questions with better identification. The first challenge is for papers that attempt to span multiple countries. For instance, papers that seek to compare the performance of different types of regimes, or to compare the performance of countries with different levels of religiosity or different types of culture. Here, the challenge, of course, is how much variation can we really use to address these questions? And prima facie, the variation that is available is basically one observation per country. Prima facie, the variation we have is, we can look around the world, we can look at countries that manage to develop, that manage to lead their population out of poverty, and we have one observation per country. So that doesn't seem a lot, particularly if you're going to try and use causal identification. Because if you do causal identification, if you use any sort of instrumental variable, you're going to further narrow down the sample to those observations that are affected, for which the level of treatment intensity is affected by an instrument. Right? So the amount of variation that is available is not very impressive. So one of the questions we're going to try and ask and answer today is, how exactly have people tried to circumvent that obstacle? And then in that literature, there are other papers that say, look, I'm interested and I try to provide an answer to a very big question, but I'm going to focus on just one specific country or one specific region. And then perhaps I'm going to use local variation to address that big question. But of course, this begs the question of, can we draw general conclusions based on the finding of just a unique paper? And how do we know, is there any rule we can use to decide that in this case, we feel safe to extrapolate, but in that other case, we're not so sure. And yet, despite these two major challenges that affect both papers using variation spanning multiple countries and papers that focus on just one region or one country, there has been significant progress in that field. Progress that is, in fact, that makes us very enthusiastic about where the field is going. And so we hope that this session can give you a little bit of a sense of some of the most fascinating questions that researchers in political economy and development, including many in this room, many of you, have addressed, and that it helps stimulate new projects. An important caveat is that we have 1 hour, which is a lot, but which is not sufficient to give justice to this burgeoning field or the burgeoning strand of the literature that we're going to try and discuss today. So, of course, we're going to omit a lot of important work. I have been, like you, in your seat in many sessions where people try to present perspectives, and then I was wondering, are they going to cite my name over there? Did they recognize the importance of my work? So we do, but we're going to have forgotten most of the names here. And it's not, a show of non-appreciation. It's just that we have limited time. But feel free to raise your hand if you see a major area of the literature that we're covering. So the way in which we have organized the session is as follows. Ben is going to talk about the long shadow of the past. Then I'll take over and talk about two types of constraints that affect policy making and economic activity and growth, that are on one hand political regimes, elections, and democracy, and on the other hand, the different facets of state capacity. And finally, Ben will conclude by talking about the role of culture and religion.
Thank you, Vincent. And I just wanted to second Vincent in thanking everyone for attending our discussion and sticking around, especially in the aftermath of a conversation with a Nobel Prize winner. It's never easy to convince people to stick around, but we did go for a very clickbait worthy title, so I like this work to some extent. Please, like Vincent said, please interrupt throughout to ask questions. I hope there will be some time left at the end to ask additional questions for about things we have or have not covered. And last word of introduction, I think when Vincent and I spend too much time together, our French accents tend to get worse and reinforce each other. And it's very apparent now as we have been working together throughout the week. So like Vincent said, I will talk a little bit about how sort of historical PE fits into broader discussion of political economy and development and recent advances in this field. And so I wanted to start with a question that I think has been asked for a long time, but sort of like always comes to the fore again, which is that, is history still part of development economics? And sometimes when you look at the historical PE literature and the experiment, especially the experimental development literature, it sort of feels like these literatures are moving into different directions. So that I'm going to try to convince you that, in fact, there are still relevant connections and bridges between those two literatures, and it pays off to sort of pay attention to what's happening in each branch of these literatures. I also want to use this as an occasion to advertise the session on long-run development, which is at 10:50, and which features four great papers, which are very good examples, I think, of fascinating work that's currently being done in historical PE and long-run development. So, you have one paper on French colonization in Africa and long-term impacts on migration. You have one paper on English colonization in India and long-term impacts on in the distribution of land. You have a great paper on the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia, and you have one paper on slavery in the Caribbean. So you have sort of the full range of these big historical questions that we still care about because we don't have all the answers, and I very much wanted to encourage you to attend this session after this discussion. So traditionally, I think, why should we care about history? There's sort of like two different answers you can give. To me, the most compelling answer is actually that there are historical episodes that are so important that we care about them, and we want to know their long-term impacts just in and of themselves. Like it's in some sense, it's not necessary to justify contemporary development challenge that emerges out of these historical episodes. These things like slavery and colonization are so important for human history that working more to understand the impact of those episodes and how they unfold over time is still work that's very relevant. But I'll go beyond that and still try to convince you that we now know from 20, 30 years of literatures from, on persistence and long-term impacts, we know that history creates practical development challenges that come in many forms. We know that, we have a whole range of inefficient and extractive institutions that have emerged out of these episodes, going back to Engelman and Sokolov, HDR, Melissa Dell, Laporta and co-authors on the importance of legal institutions. These, historical episodes have nurtured institutions that have survived to this day and very much provide scope conditions for many of the development work that you guys in this room and others at this conference are working in development economics. Another legacy of big historical episodes, of course, are low levels of social capital and trust that we observe in many parts of the world. So Mann and Wonchekon, for example, had this great paper in 2011 documenting impacts of slave raids in Africa on trust and social capital. We also have evidence coming from Italy that this is important in the long run. So that's another channel through which history connects to the present. That makes it worth studying these historical episodes. More and more, the literature has also been about studying cultural traits, cultural norms, the ecological determinants of these cultural norms. So Alessia, Giuliano, and Nunn's cow paper and the long-term impact of cow agriculture on gender norms is something that remains, I think, influential to sort of frame these conversations about the long-term impacts of culture. You have really nice work done along these lines that I'll mention in a few. And then finally, another mechanism that connects the past to the present is this idea of inadequate borders, inadequate economic geographies that mean that population sometimes is not where it should be. The spatial distribution of people is not adequate for economic development. We know that, for example, from the work of Elias and Stelios that Vincent has already mentioned, and these are very contemporary development challenges that we should incorporate into policy today. So, big picture. The past is never dead, it's not even past. That's a quote from Faulkner that Voth provides in his great discussion of this historical literature. The discussion is called Persistence, Myth, and Mystery. So I wanted to encourage you to read that review as well as Nathan's The Historical Roots of Economic Development, which is a shorter discussion in silence, but I think both of these discussions provide great sort of overview of where this particular field has gone and why it remains relevant for development economics today. The one point I want to make beyond sort of like contemplating what happened in the past 20 or 30 years of this literature is that I think the literature has really moved away from studying and understanding deep roots towards really trying to understand more dynamic theories of how institutions and culture evolve over time and sometimes move together and jointly. So we've had great theoretical contributions in that literature. So Alberto Vicin and Thierry Verdier have a 2017 paper on the joint evolution of culture institutions, and then Doron and Jim, Asemogu Robinson, also have a theory paper on the joint evolution of culture and institutions. And in general, I think that's a nice, welcome evolution of that literature. It's no longer the case that people think separately about institutions as a legacy of the past or as culture as a legacy of the past. We really think of these two things as co-moving and sort of feeding into each other, and that creates a lot of interesting research questions, as I'll argue on the next slide. How has empirical work kept up with these sort of conceptual theoretical contributions? I think very much along the same lines, there's been attempts to sort of try to understand how institutions and culture evolve jointly as a result of major historical episodes and how they fit into each other. So in my view, sort of like one perfect, good recent example of that is the paper of Sarah Lowe's and Eduardo Montero on colonial medicine in French Central Africa, where you really, they do a great job linking the past to the present and really documenting the entire dynamic causal chain that links an episode of forced medical experiments done on local populations in the 1920s and 1930s to contemporary health outcomes today, including low trust in modern medicine and a low success rate of World Bank health projects, all of which create very practical and relevant challenges for development. Another example I wanted to mention, because I think it's, especially if you are interested in teaching this material, I think it's a fantastic teaching tool. It's the paper of my co-authors Sam Bazzi and Martin Fiesbein, who's also at the U like me, on frontier culture. You might want to ask, what is the relevance of frontier culture in the US for development economics as a whole? I think it's very relevant because they do a fantastic job sort of like exploiting historical census data to the fullest and really helping us understand how one historical episode, in this case, the settlement of the US frontier, affected cultural and ideological outcomes over the medium and the long run. And if you read the paper carefully, you really see how much you can learn and how much you can get from doing very careful empirical exercises, looking at what happens within families, what happens before and after migration into the frontier and so on. It's a perfect textbook example of how much you can learn from this type of data. I have worked with Sam as well on that sort of speaks to a little bit as well, trying to connect sort of the less distant past in Indonesia, let's say the 1960s and 1970s, to contemporary culture and institutions today. So in particular, we have two papers looking, one at the land reform and the other at the schooling reform, that sort of gave rise to an ecosystem of religious institutions that sort of coexist next to the secular Indonesian state. And I hesitated putting my own name on these slides, but I decided to. And so I encourage you to read this work as well. So of course, like Vincent said, one challenge in this literature is always to go from the specific to the general. We have these fantastic case studies from specific settings, specific societies. It remains, sort of the burden of proof remains on us to prove that what we learn from specific episodes is relevant for other settings, is relevant for helping us understand development challenges more broadly, market failure, social conflict, and so on and so on. I think the frontier in that literature also lies in understanding how these different historical legacies interact with each other and jointly shape current outcomes. And I want to give one example of this. So take Africa, for example, and the literature on the political economy of Africa. We know a lot about the impact of colonization. We know a lot about the role of pre-colonial institutions from the work of Elias and Stelios and others. But like, where does the causal chain start and where do we stop drawing all of it? So in particular, we know how to link the present to colonization, but colonization itself was a byproduct of colonial explorations and the collection of colonial data that happened roughly between the 1850s and the early 1900s that were themselves shaped by pre-colonial institutions, and then those were also the outcome of something that happened before. So in particular, I've always wanted to work on this and never quite managed to, but the Bantu migration, which is one of the greatest episodes of human history, probably shaped the distribution of income and the distribution of institutions, for lack of a better word, throughout Africa. But we know very little about what happened in this distant past and how it continues to affect the present, partly because of data limitations and partly because too few people have worked on this using sort of rigorous identification methods. The Bantu migration itself was probably caused by climate change episodes that happened several thousand years ago. There's a literature in biolinguistics that studies this. The point I'm trying to make here is that all of these causal links remain unexplored. And I think we should collectively work on this and not be too scared by the limitations of data, because of course, data is getting better and there are many ways to eventually draw all these causal links and help us better understand the present. I should also say that trying to study these episodes in the distant past, to me, is an answer to the common critique you hear related to the persistence literature, which is that we compress history, right? We regress an outcome Y, modern outcome Y on a distant right-hand side variable measured in the past. We don't really account for all these dynamic things that happen in between. If you start carefully thinking about all these things in the past, I think we can make a lot of intellectual progress on this set of questions. And then finally, the caveat to all this that I wanted to mention is that studying these questions requires acknowledging that our understanding of the past in this historical PE literature remains extremely limited, extremely incomplete, and very contingent on the data that we have, which oftentimes was collected by colonial authorities or explorers or Western anthropologists, and our views remain very influenced by these quote-unquote discoveries. And to illustrate this, I want to refer to one of my favorite ever pieces of writing ever written. It's a blog post by Paul Krugman that you can find on the web. It's called The Fall and Rise of Development Economics. And what Paul Krugman does in this discussion is he mentions another paper, which I think doesn't exist, which is interesting. The other paper is called The Evolution of European Ignorance About Africa. And he compares the evolution of European ignorance about Africa to the evolution of our ignorance about development economics. And in particular, he talks about the role of Albert Hirschman in the rise of development economics and the subsequent rise of better theoretical tools that allowed us to incorporate Hirschman's work into the field. The comparison with Africa and historical PE here is the following. It's the fact that our knowledge of the distant past and how it affects the present is influenced by the data that we have, or the few papers that we had, and as a result, it remains very incomplete. So it's a bit like this map that was done in 1805 of the African continent, which contains both elements of truth. You know, the Senegal River is here, it's actually here in reality, that's correct, but then next to that you have the mountains of Kong and the mountains of the Boon, which are mountains that Europeans thought existed until very recently turned out don't exist. And then you have all of these, which is unknown parts, and we just leave it at that because there is nothing. I think sometimes our approaches in this history literature are a bit comparable to this. We don't look far enough into trying to get the right data, the right perspective, and in particular data that's produced locally by the states themselves or by people who work in local universities. I think this is the direction in which the field should go, and try to incorporate these different perspectives to really try to understand these unknown parts and get rid of the mountains of the
You guys opened up that you could ask questions, and I thought one after every section. I'm curious, so there are two trends that we have obviously seen in development economics led by the causal inference movement. One is just better causal inference. And I've seen your field has responded to that, not necessarily by randomizing the past, thankfully you were unable to do that, but by looking at natural experiments and a whole bunch of stuff. So I get that one. But there's another part of this movement, which you could see very much from our first session, which is a very active engagement in policy, changing stuff to improve stuff, right? And my question to you is, especially for people who are in this field and want to be in this field, is that desire to actually bring about interventions? Should that be something that your field needs to respond to, or should you just say, look, that's not something we ever be able to do, and we're happy not doing it, and we don't desire this need to be applied in that sense, right? Understanding is sufficient. That's a strong view to take. The second view is to say, no, actually, we need to also develop some way, and I don't know what that way is. You could imagine these indirect experiments where you say, history has created a certain structure. It's like injecting dyes in the human body to understand how the human body evolved, right? And so you could say there's some indirect RCTs I can do. If I think this historical institution was relevant, I'm going to test the power of this institution by stressing it in some ways. And there's a literature on doing those. This happens a lot in finance, where you kind of do these like indirect RCTs as well. And I'm curious in advice you would give younger researchers and others in this field, would you say, don't even worry about that, just think about causal inference, that's sufficient? Or do you want us to start thinking about that desire to have an impact in the world?
I'll give you it's a very fair set of questions. I'll give you a very personal answer, which is that, so first, like I said, I do think that if you want to study slavery, for example, it's okay if there are no immediate policies. I don't work on slavery myself, but to me, it's one of those meta questions that humanity needs to know about. And I think for that specific, there's a small set of historical episodes that are that important that indeed we don't need a precise answer to that question. I think for many other historical episodes, the question is more relevant, and indeed, why should we even work on this, and can we draw a link between these well-identified papers and some real change that can happen in the real world? So the personal answer I wanted to give to this is that yes, there is change that can happen through education and curriculum, and to me, these changes are massive. They are relevant both for what happens in developing countries, how do they learn what do they learn about their own past and how that might affect everything, you know, the way they think about life, the decisions, the economic decisions they make in their daily lives. It's also relevant in the West, in Europe, and on that, you know, I'm French. I think the curriculum in French schools about the history of colonization and the slave trade is nowhere where it needs to be in terms of understanding the past and how, in particular, those people who migrated from former colonies into metropolitan France, they don't feel like they are being really acknowledged in society. And I think all these changes in education that can happen as a result of the great research that people like Nathan and Elias and others have done, I think that's real meaningful change. And I also have worked on curriculum and schooling, and we know that these things that happen early in life that get taught in school matter. So that would be my
Yeah. So what is your view on path dependency? Because I'm writing a paper and I don't know, there was a temporary shock, and this temporary shock happened in a very relevant period of the political history of the country. So there was, for me at least, and this is what I tried to find.
which country?
Chile, this is, I'm studying in Chile. So there was, when Allende assumed the government, which was a very important political period, there was a shock, it was a weather shock. And I say, because it happened in this very important time, what happened there had long-term like effects, 50 years. And then when I start discussing on this, I kind of realized it, but maybe I'm wrong, that some people say, yeah, you're right. There was this temporary shock, important period, long-term effect. And some people say, you know, we don't believe on path dependency anymore. I don't believe this is going to. So what would be your view on that?
So to me, that type of work is still very relevant, but what has changed compared to 10, 15 years ago is that it's no longer enough to show this long-term relationship. You really need to tell us what happened in between and at least have some outcomes that you can measure in between that tell us about the channels of persistence and so on. I think that's where the literature is at. The bar to publish these types of papers and get interest from your peers and so on is really to connect the past to the present using data, using not just conceptual arguments, which often make sense, but it's important to back this up with regressions and data and so on. If you manage to do that, I think studying these persistent effects remains extremely relevant. I point you to Walter's discussion on that because he also has a nice discussion. I should leave the floor to Marcel.
I also wanted to say a word in response to Asim's question. It's true that if we look at the development economics literature of the past 15 or 20 years, it's a very interventionist literature, where development economists do an experiment, local experiment, they find something that is going to improve educational attainment. And then, of course, very logically, very naturally, the next step is, all right, I want to scale that up, I want to make sure that everyone hears about this result, that governments take it up, and that this intervention, this remedy, this medicine that's proved efficient in my small randomized experiment can benefit to the largest number of people. And what I'm going to say now, what I'm going to present now, is another way to think about that. So, political regimes, elections, and democracy. I start exactly from the departure point that I was mentioning. This micro-literature development that has accumulated rich evidence on the relative effectiveness of different anti-poverty programs. So, once you have something that is effective, that you have shown is effective at the local level, one way to go about that is to say, okay, me, myself, the researcher, or through a research lab, or through a university, I'm going to advertise that result to governments in the hope that they take it up. Another approach would be to ask yourself, what are the conditions under which a government will on its own implement and scale up that nice policy? And I think the very interventionist evolution in development economics comes a little bit from the frustration that we have all these good results and the governments are not implementing it. But perhaps there's an interesting question here. How come we have governments that are not implementing the very nice results that we found? So either we were not, addressing the questions that they were finding interesting, or there's a connection here. There's a link there's a missing link between politics that will determine which policies governments affect, their own incentives, and the actual development programs. And so I think that's, in a sense, a question that a large part of the literature in political economy addresses. Instead of just saying, okay, we're going to solve that problem by us researchers being more active with government, taking a step back and asking ourselves, how come governments are not on their own doing that stuff or scaling up nice interventions that are good and efficient? So the question here is, under which conditions will policies that are proved efficient actually be implemented? And I think your first set of conditions is that you need a good political regime, right? You need a good political regime, and then you need a regime that produces leaders that have good incentives to implement successful policies and that are of high quality, so that they will be able to understand that for this specific context, this policy is the one that is most adapted. And here there are two strands of the literature that investigate respectively the factors that affect the selection of leaders and their incentives. And this literature has mostly taken place at a very micro level, using variation within the country across the leaders that are present in different constituencies, in different municipalities. And then the second literature that has tried to assess the relative performance of different types of regimes at the more macro level. So on the first part, on politicians' incentives and selection, you really need both. You need, politicians that have the proper incentives to implement the proper policies. And here, the literature, starting with Ferraz and Finat, has emphasized the role of electoral accountability in their paper on Brazilian municipalities, where they find that mayors who are in their first term and therefore know that they will be able to run for re-election at the end of the term are typically less corrupt than mayors who have just been re-elected, and in this setting where you have a two-term limit, will not be able to run for re-election, and therefore the incentives that are otherwise provided by the perspective of having to campaign again, to talk again to voters, and to be sanctioned by voters' choice, these incentives have disappeared. In terms of the selection of politicians, the recent literature has emphasized the role both of information, but also of voter coordination. I think a naive view could be, oh, if you just inform voters about, if only voters knew that this politician, this candidate is of higher quality than that other, of course they would vote for the first. So that was the first step in that literature, and there's one this paper by Aditi Banerjee and others that asks, are voters indifferent to whether elected leaders are criminal or corrupt? And the answer is no. Voters actually start paying attention, and if you show them credible evidence that this or this candidate is corrupt, they are going to be less likely to want to vote for them. But there's a more recent paper by Siddharth George and co-authors where the point they make is that it's not sufficient to inform voters about how corrupt a politician is. You also need to inform voters that you have informed other voters about that fact. And if I know that not only I have the information about who is of higher quality, but that you also have that information, then I can expect that collectively we're going to switch to a better equilibrium where we will vote for the better candidate. And I have now incentives myself, instead of losing my vote on a non-corrupt politician, because I know that you might also coordinate on that other politician, I will do it, and we switch to a better equilibrium. And so they show that sending text messages informing not just about the level of corruption of a politician, but informing you that I have provided that information to others is going to affect people's votes. I think now in this literature we have focused a lot on very salient measures of quality, whether you're corrupt, whether you have a criminal record. We need to move towards a much more fine measure of quality, because of course, among two politicians that are not corrupt, one might be of much higher quality, much higher IQ, have much more experience, and we need to understand what are the conditions that will favor the emergence of such candidates, a little bit like the literature in political economy outside of development has done. Of course, we have in mind the papers that people have written about Sweden, where the quality of data is amazing, and this enables them to check how the quality of candidates running for municipal elections compares with the quality of other voters. But I think that the literature has to move more towards exploring other dimensions of life. We have more than 10 minutes left, don't we? I think, as you know, we're going to continue taking questions as time passes. Now, for the more macro literature on the impact of democracy, here the big question that the papers have asked is, how does democracy compare to other forms of regime, like autocracy? And so the departure point was, all right, let's really compare democracies to autocracies, and let's compare their effects first on the pace of policy reforms. Here, one of the papers I like the most is by Paola Giuliano and co-authors on democracy and reforms, where they find that the pace of reforms, different types of reforms, is much higher in a democracy than in an autocracy. Other papers for a long time, but with identification strategies that have improved over time, have measured the effect of democracy, not just on policy making, but on the end outcome that we all care about, economic growth. And I guess the latest installment in that literature is a paper by Asimov and co-authors on democracy does cause growth. You can see in the title of the paper that they are addressing this very long standing literature. Now, I think that the way in which here the literature is moving, and for good reasons, is that people are trying to open the black box of what it means to be in a democracy. Because of course, that's a treatment that has many different components. If you look, for instance, at the work by political scientists that have tried to rate the quality of democracy, they typically have an index that measures democracy as a continuous thing, not a 0-1 variable. And this index is typically aggregating many sub-indices. For instance, do you have free and fair elections? Are the rights of the opposition preserved? Are the rights of minority groups preserved? What the media landscape looks like, etc. And so I think we need to understand which of these aspects of being in a democracy are the most important if we're then going to be able to provide recommendations about what aspects of the regimes have to evolve so that better policies are implemented and more economic growth is generated. So one side of the literature has looked at the impact of ideology in that respect. For instance, there's this very nice paper by Girardi where he said, look, I'm going to do an RDD in which I'm going to compare countries in which by a small margin, a left-wing government came to power to countries where a right-wing government came to power. And I'm going to measure the effect on the short-term performance of financial markets. And what he finds is that typically you have a negative shock when a left-wing government comes to power, particularly when the policies that they were proposing were the most valuable. There's also a recent paper focusing specifically on the impact of populist leaders by Funke, populist leaders and the economy, documenting negative impact of having a populist leader leading your country. We viewed in this literature in a paper with Ben and Vincent. We see here that Vincent is actually going to present in one of the no less than 5 political economy sessions at NEUDC this afternoon at 1:30 p.m. Vincent is a PhD candidate at MIT. And we asked not what's the impact of electing a leader of a specific ideological color, but what's the impact of having an electoral turnover. So why did we get interested in that question? Well, if again you think of democracy as a bundle treatment, including many sub-treatments, one of the most important components of democracy allegedly is the fact that occasionally the party in power will lose the election. Perhaps outside of democracies you also have elections, but the party in power tends to win that election. In the democracy, defeats sometimes take place. And so the question we ask is that good or bad? Is that good or bad? On one hand, you could think it's a good thing because you're going to bring a new leader to power that has more energy, that will sense the policies that are needed for the new context. On the other hand, it might generate a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty, loss of political experience. Now, the reason why I talk about that paper, perhaps some of you think, oh, I'm not so interested in democracy, and it's, after all, perhaps it's a very, democracy has weakened, it's a very old idea, etc. But perhaps you might be interested from a methodological point of view. Because what we're trying to do here is to say, all right, let's look at these questions of measuring electrical turnovers in a cross-country setting. Right? Because again, most of the literature has done either very local work using local variation from local elections, and therefore having lots of variation available, because for instance, if you do any work in France, in municipal elections, you have 36,000 municipalities. So, for each and every election, you have 36,000 potential data points. And then there's another literature that has looked at the effect of regimes, but using a much more macro perspective with one observation per country and doing work that is less identified. And we try to bridge a gap between these two literatures by saying, let us do a regression responsibility design, but in a cross-country setting, without one observation, not per country, but one observation per country per election. I'm just giving you a quick anticipation here, but I encourage you to see the presentation that Vincent is going to make this afternoon. As you can see in the paper, we can plot these graphs where you have close elections here at the threshold, where the party in power and a challenger party have exactly the same vote share. And then we can say, okay, what happens when you're on the right of the threshold, where the challenger party has a positive vote share, what happens on the left of the threshold, and we find a positive effect of turnovers in that setting. So go to Vincent's presentation if you want to understand more the results and the mechanisms that we study in the paper. Now, this is just one set of constraints that can prevent policymakers from implementing the policies that we development economists have patiently demonstrated are effective. There's another set of constraints, another set of conditions that are required for good policies to be implemented. And that second set of conditions, beyond just having a good regime that selects good politicians with good incentives, is to have a state that has sufficient capacity to implement these policies in an effective way. So you can perfectly imagine a world where you have an enlightened leader that is extremely good, that has to run for re-election, and therefore they have all the proper incentives aligned. Voters are very informed, and so they will hold that politician accountable, and still that politician will choose the right policy, but nothing will really happen, will really take place, because down the line, this policy is not actually implemented. So there's, I think, a big strand of the literature here with exciting work, including very recent work on these questions that has looked at different components of state capacity. The first component, something that I myself have come to understand over the years, is that if you want anything to happen, you first need proper information about the needs of the population. To prioritize policies and targets, to decide whether you want to put all your money or the government budget on education or instead on health, you need to understand where your country sits relative to other countries, and then to decide whether you're going to target this specific group or this specific region, you need to have a lot of information about where are education outcomes the best in your country and where are they lagging behind. Now, we know, in fact, from the work of historians that the construction of reliable public statistical systems was a driving force behind the establishment of modern states. For instance, there's work showing that in Germany, under the Weimar Republic, so at the beginning of the 19th century, you had a systematic effort to improve the statistical apparatus. And this enabled the state to understand what was going on its territory and to intervene and improve its services. Now, of course, we know also, all of us who have done, for instance, work collaborating with local governments around the world in developing countries, that today in many countries, administrative data on health or education outcomes often remain unreliable. I have done some work, for instance, on tuberculosis, where I was talking to TB officials in India, and I was asking them, okay, what's the prevalence of tuberculosis in the constituency, in the district that you are focusing on? And they were telling me, do you want the official numbers? I said, yeah. And they said, these are the numbers, but you cannot trust them. And these were the people responsible of handling tuberculosis. And it's not that they themselves were not putting effort, they just realized that the health apparatus, the public hospitals that they could rely on, were not providing we're not providing reliable numbers. And this, of course, if you're sitting in Delhi and you are administering the TB program, is a big hurdle, because how do you know which states you have to focus on? How do you know which districts in the states you have to focus your efforts on? A second component of state capacity is, of course, tax capacity. If you're going to implement a policy, you need to have resources, and there's a lot of exciting work that has been done, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo by Balland, Bergeron, Jonathan Wagon, and co-authors, where they have looked at different ways to improve state capacity. So that's very exciting work. I think we need more work outside of Congo as well, because this team is, has a stream of papers from that state. But at some point, this raises the question of whether what they find in the DRC is relevant for also other countries. You then need effective bureaucrats. You need bureaucrats to actually implement the policy that you have decided. And I'm going to say a bit more about that. And finally, there is a question about the dynamic interactions between these different functions, between the legibility, between the tax capacity, between the effectiveness of the bureaucracy. And there are some papers here in the line of what Ben was saying before, papers that have tried to trace the historical regions of comparative development across different regions within a country. There are some papers that look at the interactions to identify the mechanisms explaining the persistence of initial shocks, interactions between these different dimensions. And one of them is a paper by Ben and co-authors on the dynamic consequences of state building, where they look at evidence in the French Revolution, where at the time of the French Revolution, a decision was taken to assign administrative roles to some cities in a quite a random way. And they trace how this initial assignment produces effects on the city growth, on the city level outcomes still until today. So let me say a little bit more about data quality. The first challenge here, if you're a researcher, is first to measure the data quality, because which data are you going to use to assess that the quality of data is not? It's a little bit of a circle here, and I think the approach that has been used here is twofold: is to compare some official sources of data. For instance, in the example I provided before, official sources on the prevalence of tuberculosis in the certain district, with data that are either collected by the research team. And here there's a very innovative paper that Ben Olken wrote in 2007, 15 years ago, where he was studying corruption, and he was assessing the level of corruption by comparing official statistics, official reports, with reports, for instance, about the quality of the road that was coming from investigation by the research teams that actually took samples from a road to understand how much material had been put on the road, and to compare that input with the input that was officially reported, and detecting that some roads had much less material than had been reported. Another approach, and here there's a really cool paper by Luis Martinez from Chicago, Paris. Another approach is to compare official data with data that you can measure without relying on official sources, but that nonetheless you think are trustworthy. This paper is on how much should we trust the dictator's GDP growth estimates. Luis compares official growth estimates with the estimates that you can construct by looking at night lights, and he identifies that in dictatorships you have data of worse quality because autocrats tend to lie more about the performance of the country than in democracy. And then the second question is how to improve data quality. The concern here is that bureaucrats that are responsible of administering a program have an incentive not just to improve the performance of that program, but also to lie about that performance, because it's oftentimes the same person that not only administers the program, but also communicates about the outcomes of that program. Again, think about that the official. So one option here is to use technology to improve monitoring in a decentralized way, so that you can better monitor agents of the state that are located in many different places. And I have a paper with Thomas Bossuet and Claire de la Valade, where we show in that context of tuberculosis in India, that putting biometric devices in local treatments of tuberculosis enables to generate much better data on the number of patients that have come to take their medicines and on the attendance of the health workers. And I'll just say one word before giving again the floor to Ben about another component of state capacity, effective bureaucrats. Remember how I emphasized that when you look at politicians, there are two dimensions. One is you have politicians with the proper incentives, and the second, you have the proper type, the proper selection of politicians. Well, the same dichotomy can be used to think about the performance of bureaucrats. The first dimension is you have a good selection of bureaucrats. And here there's exciting recent work about the effect of merit-based versus discretionary appointments, where many countries, starting from richer countries, have evolved over time towards merit-based appointments. And there's work on the other part of the dichotomy, on the incentives that democrats can receive. Here, the question is, can you give bureaucrats incentives to exert effort, but at the same time, shield them from political interference, from the risk of being removed by a politician that is disagreeing with them politically. Here, what we know from, again, our experience as development economists running experiments, and the frustration that sometimes we manage to find an intervention that works at a local level, but that fails to scale up. For instance, as was the case in that paper by Banerjee and authors on treating abandoned other groups, they find that incentives work for nurses in the Indian public healthcare system, but the moment in which the research team leaves the field, the moment in which they try to scale that up, that fails to work. Why? Because there is opposition by the local agents of the state, by the nurses in that case, to the intervention that was being implemented. So Page and Pandey have a review paper where they discuss this type of concerns, and they have a very nice characterization of the principal agent problem that characterizes the relationship between the central state and the local agents of the state. And there's exciting work about how the principal agent problem can be solved. For instance, this paper by Marianne Bertrand authors on the incentives that bureaucrats have in India at the top level. And I think there's also a question that could be hopefully addressed by future work on providing incentives to bureaucrats that do not just depend on the performance, but that depend on implementing a program that has been found effective at the local level.
Thanks, Vincent. And are there any questions? So I'm going to spend.
Thank you, this Vincent. The policy of not generating good data is a part of the policy.
The policy
of not generating data is also a part of the policy. So that's what is happening in many developing countries. That you don't want to produce evidences, good evidences, because that puts you in trouble. And that is being seen in many developing countries, including India. So how you look at it, because we always look for generating new evidences, but the policy looks for, or the government works in a different path. So that actually give a trouble for the academicians and also generating new evidences that might brings new policy. So there is, I find it some problem in that context.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mentioned the risk that there's forgery on the data that are generated, but in some cases, the problem is even bigger because no data is generated at all. And sometimes this comes from a resistance from local bureaucrats. Occasionally, it can be a decision by the central state. There is, for instance, evidence about China today, where the central state has a yearbook in which they publish yearly statistics about how the Chinese economy is doing. And the size of that statistical yearbook has shrunk over time because the central state wants to stop communicating about how different sectors are performing.
No, you are targeting to bureaucrats. I would say it is beyond bureaucrats. So it's not bureaucrats is one component, but it's beyond bureaucrats. If you look at the issues, particularly in my country, it's beyond bureaucrats. So it's not in the hand of bureaucrats, it's above that. So something is being instructional, like, okay, we don't want to produce that evidence because of some political reasons.
Right, yeah, that's why I was mentioning the example of the central state in China, because in this case, the problem is not coming from a local bureaucrat. And so here I would go back to the first set of conditions I was mentioning, which is to have a solid regime with proper incentives, and held properly accountable by their population. I do want to give Ben a few minutes to talk about other conditions, other constraints that can affect policy making and eventually economic outcomes.
And I'll spend no more than 2 minutes on this and make a couple of very simple points because I do want to allow for 1 or 2 minutes for additional questions. But like Vincent said, if you think about what political scientists call scope conditions around what makes development policies work or not work, you can also think of culture and religion in this particular way. And there, the one point I want to stress is that there's one very nice evolution that happened in the literature in the last 10 years or so. So it's the following. 10 years ago, I was starting my PhD, it was 2013, and I was told by someone in the profession, your job market paper will not be considered an economics paper if it doesn't have an economic variable on the left-hand side. And I think that has changed. I think there's much more acceptance now of the fact that cultural outcomes, ideological outcomes, and so on can be relevant outcomes to look at. And that's partly coming from this dialogue with theory, where we now understand that economic variables, culture, and institutions all live together. And that's why it's also important to understand the determinants of these cultural objects. And I want to give you very quickly 3 examples of that, which are examples that the literature has been interested in. One is everything that has to do with the determinants and consequences of gender norms. So we know a lot more about the origins of these norms from work that I already mentioned. And we now also try to understand how gender norms can themselves be shaped by policy, by interventions, and so on. So I'm sure all of you know this recent AR paper by Person et al., where they show that social concerns, economic beliefs, and so on can matter for the persistence of certain gender norms and attitudes towards female labor force participation. I think that's a very nice and welcome evolution in this literature. You can think about ethnic conflict and ethnic divisions a bit in a similar way. Owen has done some of the most amazing work on this in recent years. Ethnic divisions are an outcome and a right-hand side variable, and we're starting to understand much more about the consequences of ethnic conflict, both sort of like within government in the context of ethnic favoritism, policies allocated to certain ethnic groups versus others. But we also know a lot more now about what happens within firms and within markets. There was a great paper by Gosh at the NBR Summer Institute in Development about religious divisions inside Indian firms. That's a very great example of where this literature has gone. And then I should also mention religious beliefs as a relevant cultural outcome to look at, which is also something that the literature has been interested in. Sorry for the typos here. There's an excellent review by Sasha Becker and Shai Rubin, going back to the PE literature that sort of talks about this relationship between religion and both. Owen?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So this is kind of related to the last point as well. I guess the title of this session is Political Economy and Development. So we're all development economists in one way or another, development / something. And one of the reasons why development economics exists is we think there's a limit to what we can learn from economics research in rich countries, okay, as applied to the rest of the world. I'd love to get your thoughts on that distinction within political economy. Right? It seems to me that distinction is even greater within political economy. Right? If you're sketching a model for an OECD country in political economy, you're assuming property rights are secure, and you're assuming contracts will be enforced, and you're assuming there's maybe not ethnic polarization to the extent that it affects political behavior. Those things don't really carry over to a lot of the world, maybe even most of the world. So do you think there's a very sharp distinction within political economy? Do you think there's a limit to what we can learn from the political economy textbooks as applies to development?
And my sense is that here you're, in a sense, making a point that should receive empirical support about how different the political systems work in richer and less rich countries, in democracies and non-democracies. And it seems to me that I would agree with your point, but that we need more evidence to substantiate that point. And that's the reason why we need cross-country work that is going to compare the way in which different types of regimes work, the way in which local institutions perform in a democracy or in a less democratic system. And this is where the field is going. But for now, you're right that we have a lot of work, because this work is very micro, that has either provided evidence on well-established old democracies like the US or European countries, or instead in countries like India. And we have literatures that have been too separate, whereas indeed some of the most fascinating questions are how does the difference in institutions between these two types of regimes affect policy making and economic?
I think we need to wrap up. Unfortunately, but thanks so much for joining us.
We have a break on purpose. If you have follow-up questions, I hope you guys are around for a bit. So
Wait for the 2024 election and we will see how much
Maybe it's
convergence there will be between different countries.